The three nations, and we don't often hear them in the news because in the great competition, the great defining contest of the 21st century so far between the US on the one side and China on the other for competition, these have been, as you say, firmly in the US camp. And the three of them are tiny nations in terms of population, but they occupy enormous swathes of the Pacific Ocean, and they are Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, or often abbreviated as FSM. And their territorial waters abut each other so that they form a continuous band of oceanic realm to the immediate north of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. So they're in a critical strategic chunk of the Pacific Ocean, and together they have a wider territorial reach than the whole breadth of Australia or the whole breadth of the continental US, for that matter.
So it's now come to your attention that the US has pact with this, that the time frame of this is about to run out. You would presume that they would want to renew this post-haste.
Well, we're indebted for pointing out that there's a bit of a snag here, Bev, to a chap called Charles Edel, who is at an important think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. And he's raised the alarm over this because he's pointed out that all of these countries, the three of them, have so-called compacts of free association with the US, which are strategic deals. They were all signed in the 1980s, and they're all coming up for renewal. And now all the countries involved have signed agreements with the US to renew. These three countries are keen to turn over these agreements with the US for another 20 years. The US is keen to. The documents are all done, but the funding is the missing piece of the puzzle. And the Biden administration, believe it or not, together with the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, has been trying to get this funding through the US Congress and failed. And the renewed funding, the deadline for the new funding, comes up this year for two of those three states in the Pacific and next year for the third. There was an attempt to get them funded last year. It failed. Even when you had both the major parties in the House, plus you had the president himself trying to get this done, and it's failed and it's slipping. And Charles Edel has raised the alarm and said, guys, if we don't renew these 20-year deals, which are already signed and sealed, but we can't deliver, then we are simply opening the door to Beijing to step in and say, OK. And he told me that already there's a persistent rumour that in the capitals of those three Pacific Island states, Chinese diplomats have been saying, whatever the US is offering you, we will offer you 3 times as much to sign a similar arrangement with us, with China. So it's opening potentially, unless this funding is organised post-haste, it's potentially opening the door, surrendering a long-standing US strategic monopoly over those islands, because I should explain that the terms of those compacts of free association mean that what the three countries get out of it is they get to travel freely, live freely, work freely in the US if they should choose. They can join the American Defence Forces if they so choose, have rights and entitlements to American payment systems, support, welfare, all of that. But in return, the US has a monopoly over military access, naval access through their territorial waters, and basing rights, military basing rights in those countries. And so Charles Edel has pointed out that unless the US can organise the funding post-haste, those deals will lapse, those countries will need the money to keep their budgets running, and China is standing there willing, chequebook in hand, to step in and just unopposed assume influence and potentially displace the US as the hegemon in that enormous stretch of the Pacific, which the US, together with Australia and New Zealand and other allies, fought so hard to deny to the Japanese in World War II.
It's remarkable. I do want to get your take, Peter, on what lesson Australia is expected to learn from the extraordinary, the astonishing sentence that was handed down to the Australian writer yesterday, Yang Hengjun?
Well, the lesson that China wants Australia to learn and to make sense of this, I think you have to join some dots. It's the third of three dots, which together mark a trend line, I think. The first was 3 months ago. You'll remember that an Australian naval vessel, the HMAS Toowoomba, was encountered in a dangerous naval manoeuvre with the People's Republic Army Navy, People's Liberation Army Navy, in international waters, where the hearing of some of the Australian sailors was damaged with the reckless use of a dangerous sonar by the Chinese. That was the first one. The second one is this case yesterday, which, as you say, is a shocking, just completely disproportionate and outlandishly harsh punishment for Yang Hengjun, the Australian citizen. And the third is, in between those two events, was the Chinese ambassador to Canberra making these absurd and condescending remarks saying that Australia has to, quote, stop making trouble for China. This combined, I think, is trying to send the signal, well, very effectively is sending the signal, Bev, that stabilisation of the relationship is a nonsense, is not achievable, that China retains the right to damage Australia, to unsettle Australia, to deny Australia what it wants at any particular point.
Yeah, and it just shows you then too, Peter, just how critical the strength of the US-Australia relationship is when you have that kind of conditional relationship playing out.
Yeah, when you put those two stories together that we've just been discussing, and you see those two factors, the increasing unreliability and unpredictability of the US as our ally, and the increasing bellicosity and assertiveness and sometimes downright aggression of China on the other as our main rival, it's a very unsettling strategic position for Australia to be in. It's an argument for Australia to do much more in its own right as an independent sovereign entity to prepare itself internally and externally for a long and difficult coexistence with both China and the US. And the Chinese lesson here, again, connecting those three dots, is that while Australia had lost its fear of China in the last few years and successfully stood up to China, and China then appeared to back down, the Beijing government is now sending us the message that they want us to be afraid of China once again.
Remarkable. Always good to get your take on things, Pete. Thanks so much.
Happy to, Bev.